And it's sort of great pleasure to welcome Sanjeev Vidyarthi, who's been here before and has been a participant in many of our conversations. Sanjeev is, he's a premier scholar and actually a leader in the field of urban planning and design. And a scholar because he has done very important groundbreaking work and has covered a whole spectrum where he's written very recently, actually co-written and co-edited 2 volumes which have looked at urban planning history in India. And these are seminal because that kind of capturing of urban planning history hasn't happened, especially since South Asia and the various nations became independent. And I think it's a very important piece of work. But he's also been simultaneously writing about Jaipur, which is a city he works in and lives in. He's done a fantastic architecture guide on Jaipur. I'm honored that he did a book on one of our projects in Jaipur. So he's written extensively and incredibly nimble in terms of the kind of spectrum of issues he covers, but in the process always beginning to attempt to connect urban planning, urban design, and architecture, which often get left in different silos. And I think that is a very important and big contribution that Sanjeev has made. He studied architecture, he studied urban design, he obtained his PhD from the University of Michigan. He's now teaching at UIC in Chicago, where he actually started a new, rather inventive and immersive Master of City Design, MCD, which is really an urban design program. And we were talking about it earlier. And what's fascinating about the approach they've taken, and I, again, have the honor of having been on the board, him thinking this through, is unlike, say, our urban design program, which takes architects and moves them towards planning through equipping them with kind of the literacy to connect planning and architecture and make urban design. They've done the opposite. They take architects, but they immerse them in urban planning thinking and then draw them back into architecture. And so through code, through policy, and much more literacy on that count. So it's a different approach to urban design, which is very, very exciting. Sanjeev also, and I think this is a very important aspect, he was the founding member of the group that set up the Ayodhyan School of Architecture in Rajasthan. This is a standalone school of architecture in the state of Rajasthan, which yet operates. He was not complaining, but observing that now it's become very regional, which is how they had intended to be a school with national presence, but it's become regional. But then he's going to talk about this, I think, a little bit. The schools of architecture in places like South Asia now necessarily have to address more regional issues to make things operational on the ground, and how one makes a balance between trying to create what might be the regional sensibilities that need to be addressed, but also these sort of impulses to address questions at the national level is an interesting challenge for pedagogy generally. And I think the school was a good experiment, and I think he's beginning to reflect about it now, and maybe he will influence ways that this might change. And so Sanjeev, as you can see, spans in his interest all the way from architecture. He's a pedagogue. He's set up a school of architecture, written extensively on urban planning, but also on architecture. And so with that, Sanjeev, I'm going to ask you to make your presentation, and I hope we can keep half an hour to have a discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Rahul. That was a very generous introduction. And I want to thank Rahul for saying things which many people don't know. These have been sort of over years the kind of things I've done, and I also want to thank Vishda, someone whose work I admire, for coming tonight. This is very encouraging and important that you are here. And thank you all, for coming out. Samosas and chai are fantastic, but I hope the talk matches the standards with this as well, which will see. I'll just keep it like this if someone will go. Yeah? Okay. Okay, so I'm calling this talk, this is sort of the larger focus of my work over the last 20 or so years, studying how India plans and builds its cities. And I came to this question by working as an architect in the city of Jaipur for about 12 years after I graduated. My generation was lucky. We graduated in the year India began to open its economy, 1991, right? So it was a boom time suddenly. The city of Jaipur, city of about 2.5 million then, had about 40 architects for a city of 2.5 million. And most of them worked for state agencies. So there were not many people and our practice thrived. But in a few years, I sort of began to wonder why I designed the way I did. Where were these ideas like ground coverage and setback and planned neighborhoods and master plans? Where were they coming from? That intrigued me a lot. And I sort of came to graduate school to figure out this answer. The literature that I could find and I could read sort of eliminated a little bit, but it did not satisfy my intellectual curiosity. Since my practice had done well, I had the luxury of taking a sabbatical. I came to graduate school and sort of started reading it. I loved it so much, I never left. I'm still there. I'm still, this question sort of catches my interest. I still do field work actively trying to figure out what's happening in India now, you know. But this is sort of the backdrop. The question that today's talk sort of focuses more sharply on who's theorizing architectural practices and how, right? So the bigger question, and I will sort of talk about that, and I'll, some of the talk would sort of relate to it, how the two are interrelated, but this is a sub-project that sort of fits in within that larger project that we are going to talk about. And how I came to this question about theorizing architectural practices, that sort of grew out when we were working on this book that Rahul just mentioned. This is a project that RMA did in the city of Jaipur that I studied. And Rahul sort of observed at some point in time that my work had gone too far away from architecture. He said, now you are mostly urban planning and you're not writing on architecture stuff. So this sort of instigated my interest back. And I said, this is an important point. And it's an important point because architects still sort of make up the largest group of trained professionals in South Asia. That are sort of involved in shaping the way cities get built. Whether architects, as architects as urban designers, people who specialize in planning and go on to become town planners and so on and so forth. So by themselves as a community, architecture fraternity, despite of all its shortcomings and gaps that you could point out, they still remain an important point. So I sort of turned my attention to see what's happening in architecture. What does theorize means? So just so that we are all on the same page, this is how Merriam-Webster describes it, to form a theory, right? So my interest was who's trying to theorize Indian architectural practices? Is there anyone? And if they are, then what kind of theories they are coming up with, right? What are the venues? What do they mean by theory? So a simple question, who's theorizing architectural practices in South Asia? So we expanded it beyond India, including Pakistan, Afghanistan, right? The SAARC nations, you could say Nepal, Sri Lanka. And the short answer to this question is there are very few people who claim that they are theorizing. If you start looking at the literature, there are very few people who say, hey, theory of Indian architecture, or there's a text that says theorizing it. And there are few examples that where people, for example, this is a book that came out a few years ago, where Peter Scriver and Amit sort of tried to track modern architecture in history since 80s. They theorize it from a historical lens. There's some other examples like John Lang's book, which, he sort of writes a very concise history of modern architecture. This is again a book which is pretty recent. And then there are books like this, which Remy was talking about. This is a book on Jaipur that a group of 3 French professors, 2 from the School of Toulouse, National School of Architecture in Toulouse, and 1 from Paris, sort of wrote, looking at the origin and the development of Jaipur's historical core. And they theorized it from the perspective of art history and from the perspective of historical development of tropical architecture. So there's some examples at the city level like this. But, this was clear that there is more scholarly writing around architectural practices in in that part of the world today than perhaps ever before. There is a sizable amount of literature that exists. So my research assistant, Nawaz Shafat Nawaz, who is from Lahore and is working on a doctoral degree with me, we began to sort of took a deep dive, and we sort of looked at the top 20 journals and reputed book publishers. And this is important to keep in mind, and I'll come to it a little bit later. There's a lot of gray literature on South Asia that's appearing, so open access journals, all kind of journals. So we looked at, and you'll see the list of the journals in a little bit, and serious presses. And we found that, in the 21st century, so this was important. In the 21st century, we find about 170 articles and 80 books that sort of map different aspects of architectural practices in South Asia. They cover substantial ground, but they essentially, at some level, they form a very impressive body of empirical knowledge, illustrating fields development from a rich variety of perspectives and positions. Now, method-wise, folks who are interested in doing this kind of research, two things stood out for us when we were examining this corpus of knowledge. Number one is historians' approach of studying change over time, right? So Indian architecture, one could argue, for example, is pretty well theorized until 70s and 80s, when we have, we know modern. So at some level, it stopped at Chandigarh when several of us, Vishda and Rahul and I went to school, right? I mean, Indian architecture sort of takes off and then Chandigarh, and then there's a lull until Rahul writes the book Beyond 1990s, following the steps of great masters. There was that moment of silence, right? So that change over time is a very useful device. If you want to describe what's happening today, you can always compare it to what was happening 30 years ago. And then you can, right, always do this. This is very important. Change over time. So that's one aid that and I'll use that throughout. And the second, this is an important one, the pragmatist insistence. So pragmatists are a group of thinkers who follow into the footsteps of an American philosopher called John Dewey. John Dewey he sort of coined this idea of pragmatism. Pragmatism is one of the few homegrown philosophies that come out of the United States. And the argument that they make is especially relevant for us tonight, is they insisted on paying attention to what people and practitioners do on the actual ground. They said, theory is not me writing about someone's works. That's one form of theory, right? Theorizing. I'm theorizing someone else's work. But the most important theory comes out of what people actually do on the ground. So when people are making plans, you pay attention to what kind of plans they are making, how they are making plans, why they are making the plan that way. That is the real theory. The only theory that stands the pragmatist test is how was it made, right? Did people actually make it in real surroundings? So that's an important one. So we pay attention to this as well. And then in this sense, architects sort of get criticized for this, but this is important for us, that architects' use of case study, architects love case studies. That's one thing, that's one research method they got down, case studies. The second thing they got down is documentation, right? We spend a lot of years studying documentation. In this case, so if we use the pragmatist insistence on paying attention to what people and practitioners do on the actual ground, these are very important. Because then the case study and documentation together across authors as empirical works tells us what kind of different environments are being built across India's regional scale. It's empirical knowledge, because the documentation, the good thing about architectural documentation is it follows a protocol, right, including scale and north, and it's precise. It's always exact. And then the case study is constant, right? I mean, that's a method. So if you look at Rahul's work and Bimal's work and Doshi's work and someone else's work across space, paying attention to change over time and seeing what they actually did on the ground, not what they say, what was built and how it was built, then that's a solid empirical database that tells us what's happening across the country at different points in time, right? So you keep these two insights in mind. So for example, this book that was published a few years ago by Bimal and Catherine, tracking the words of Hashmukh Patel, cases across time from 1963 to 2003, or this book that Rahul compiled a couple of years ago, right? Sort of tracking his work. These are empirical then, these are empirical basis for understanding understanding as what's happened, right? Different kind of works among India's rich regional context. And then this book, for example, where Harshad Bhatia tracks, right? So this is sort of a biographical piece, the making of an architect, explaining, again, using cases, or a more recent one that just came out from the Set Press, 1930s to 1950s, right? So if we sort of put all of this work together of people writing about their own work as cases and using those drawings, you find that there is a very rich empirical base that architects have created, right? And these cases by themselves in isolation might not make sense. But when we put them together and sort of read through and read across them, then it becomes a very important and very interesting empirical base. So that's sort of, but before we dive deeper into that corpus of knowledge, I want to set up the bigger picture here by first talking about India's tumultuous ongoing reshaping at the landscape scale, right? That's how I sort of come to that question. And it sort of goes back to my original research question, how India plans and builds its cities. So that's story one. Then there is a second story, emergent landscape of professional practitioners in that part of the world, and talk about these two before we sort of come to the case of theorizing of architectural practices. And then I want to leave some time for discussions and questions towards the end. So about 30 minutes from this point is my sense. So start in 2010, around 2011, 2012, we wrote this book where we were tracking how India's new approach to spatial planning and development was emerging. Few things stood out, right? So it's over time. This research happens in 2010 and then 2012. So in 12 years, you will see how much change that sort of happened. At this time, we found in early 21st century that there was increasing recognition of cities as engines of economic growth in India. And this was happening cities began to emerge prominently on the national imagination. So it's the leadership at the federal level, leadership at the provincial level, some of the cities taking a little more interest, and then many private actors who get sort of involved. Almost the same time, there was a move away from the state to other and many emergent actors in the urban planning and city building field. Speculators, investors, private real estate developers, contractors of all kinds, multinational firms. There is a whole, apart from the state, there is an emergent group of actors that are getting involved. And there was a new urban dynamic in the air, even as glass seemed half empty, half full. Half empty in the sense that the regulations, the tools for planning, the approach to planning still remain very post-colonial. And one could argue even today, India continues to, for example, use master plans to do urban expansion. And we know master plans as a device have not worked in most parts of the world, including in South Asia. So it seems sort of, half empty. It was not very inclusive. But then again, it was half full because these were major changes. And this urban dynamic we found in more recently, it sort of now bears fruit with landscape scale, what I call tumultuous reshaping of that country along many dimensions. For example, a small thing, but that has huge implications, is all-weather road network now across that country. From most villages in India, you can get on an all-weather Pakka road and go to Delhi or Mumbai or Calcutta. This was unimaginable just a few years ago. So for example, this is the heartland state of Uttar Pradesh. And you sort of see, this is the roads that we see on this are only the major roads. It's only the national highways and state highways and major district roads. You cannot put village roads and other roads on this map because otherwise the whole thing gets filled up. It's all black there. And, and Beshda would remember this. In 70s, there was this big debate at the World Bank side. Then one of the easiest way in the field of development studies, this idea had a lot of traction, that one of the easiest ways to do economic development, or two easier ways to do economic development. One is education of girl child, because if you educate the girl child, it has salubrious and long-lasting effects. And the second was to make rural roads. If you made rural roads and connected the village to the nearest city, the outcome of just that road, because it changes the land use, it creates economic activity, the produce travels. So, and this road network across that nation is a huge change that has happened in recent years. And then the urban, I call it the red hot urban sector at this point in time. Back in the 70s, urban was one of the least preferred ministries at the national and the provincial level. And today it's one of the most premium ministries. There is a consistent support from CSS. Those are centrally sponsored schemes. So in India's sort of federal system, there are few priority areas that the federals support directly through what they call centrally supported schemes. So schemes, some of you might be familiar with JNNURM or smart cities, right? These are directly funded by the center. And then there is a provincial focus. Most chief ministers currently directly engage with urban development and housing in very important ways. And then a lot of local support. So the urban is super hot. And then all of this sort of brings a parallel cultural change. Besh has written about planning culture of places, and I would sort of propose here that the planning culture in that country has sort of begun to change in important ways, because what we are sort of studying here are more outcomes or more manifestations, but the real thing that sort of drives some of it is a change in the planning culture. So this is where the state of Uttar Pradesh is. These are some of the highest densities in the world. Muhammad Qadir wrote about this idea in 1970s that from Kolkata here, right? This is Kolkata, and this is Lahore. This is one single city, and that idea still holds true. If density was the parameter, forget political jurisdictions and political boundaries. It's several states, right? It's Bengal, Bihar, UP, Delhi, Haryana, Punjab, and then bigger Punjab. Forget those political jurisdictions. But if you sort of looked at this, and this is the old Grand Trunk Road, built in 14th century, that still sort of serves as the backbone of this structure. And the state of Uttar Pradesh is here. So you can imagine, while they're making these roads, how contentious this process would have been. And what kind of changes this kind of a dense road network brings in a place that's as dense as this. Yeah. So along with this landscape scale, tumultuous reshaping, right? It's incredible the kind of urban landscapes that are emergent at different scales. The professional practice is also changing. And that landscape is equally interesting for us in this room to sort of look at. One is an arrival of multinational design and planning firms. Almost all the large firms in the world now sort of have begun to set up India offices or have projects directly dealing with. On the urban front, so not so much in architecture design, but on the urban sector, many management firms. So McKinsey has an urban planning division. Boston Consulting Group, you name one, Ernst & Young, right? So this is kind of new. Deloitte, right? I mean, who would have imagined? And after pandemic, I haven't interviewed folks after pandemic, but after pandemic, apparently it seems that more and more of them have shifted towards state and public sector consulting, because that seems to be a more steady source of income than private consulting. So this is a new trend. And then there are all sort of new planning agencies. Most states have set up planning agencies for large metropolitan regions, specialized planning agencies for heritage areas, for example, specialized planning agencies for specific sectors like tourism and so on and so forth. And then some of the older institutions like National Institute of Urban Affairs, which had been around since 60s, mostly dormant, has suddenly sort of, reinfused with. So that sort of changes the landscape quite quickly. And then closer to home, there is a growing professional associations network nationwide. So Indian Institute of Architects, basically colonial institution founded in 1880s in Mumbai. Indian Town Planning Institute, more post-colonial, founded in early 1950s in Delhi. And then Indian Institute of Interior Designers, founded in 80s, Pune. Right? So these three have the numbers and their growth across the nation, and I'll show you some examples, has been very exponential. And then many new schools of architecture as well as planning across the country. This is in total together, these create a huge landscape of professional practitioners. We don't really pay attention to it, so I wanted to show a few slides. This is so just to put this into perspective, when India gains independence in 1947, town planning or urban planning does not exist as a recognized government activity. The state is not actually playing. I mean, cities have, Mumbai and Delhi, the larger cities, and Karachi and Lahore have a little town planning wing within their UITs or their municipal corporations, but it's not a recognized government activity. And this shows you the presence of town and country planning directorates across India. So in 60 years, town planners, in fact, have done perhaps even better than architects and interior designers in using state patronage to sort of spread their profession across, given that their numbers are so small. Even today, the total number of town planners in India is less than 10,000 for a country of 1.4 billion. Compare that with architects, which are about 150,000, or interior designers, which are even perhaps more.
What do the colors signify?
Well, so these are the town planning directorates, headquarters of the town planning departments. So mostly state capitals. And then these are the Indian Town Planning Institute's chapters. They call it the regional chapter. And then there are some regional centers. Some states, for example, IITPI has a regional chapter at Jaipur, but it also has a regional center at that. So some states have two. So what are these? These are essentially places that IITPI owns. Most planners in that part of the work with government agencies. So they allotted themselves land. So these are, nicely built regional centers in each of these places. And then these are planning schools. Remember, the first two schools in India that emerged are School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi, and IIT Kharagpur, same time, 1956. From 1956, they are now almost many. So this is one. I mean, we could have done the same thing for IIA and IIID, but this gives you a sense, knowing it from the perspective of the lesser known sister profession. Then these are some excerpts from the Council of Architecture's plan, where they sort of shows the tumultuous growth in the schools of architecture. So when I went to school, for example, in 80s, there were only 30 schools. That number would have been here. And then sort of that rises quickly, and then it falls, right? So it's tumultuous. So after this, it falls. Currently, this is about 460 schools. Yes. So that means in the last 5 years, about 70 schools have shut down. Yeah. But look at this graph. It's fast. And these schools need to be, they employ faculty. And one of the requirements for faculty increasingly is to publish. So some of the papers that we looked at are being published by these guys, right? That's the hook to the story. But currently, for the time being, focus on the tumultuous growth, right? I mean, just imagine what kind of ramping up is this? From 173 schools and 200 schools in 200 to 500. Yeah. And then the number of seats have grown, and then you sort of see that they begin to fall here. The seats fall quickly while the schools are still increasing. That means the seats are empty. People are not taking admission. And this sort of shows you percentage of seats vacant from this, right? So it's tumultuous. There's growth in the number of institutions, but the students not taking admission. Very tumultuous landscape at that level. So with these two backgrounds, right? The country is undergoing this kind of rapid change, and then the professional landscape is changing. We want to keep these two in mind when we began to dive into who's theorizing architectural practices and how. So we focused on 21st century, and these were the journals we sort of identified and looked at. And this is architecture, right? So we're not looking at urban planning, we're not looking at urban design, we're not looking at other subfields, and we find 176 broadly. I mean, if we find more, it would increase the universe, but it would not necessarily change what we were looking for or what we found. And then we sort of looked at where were these authors based? What were their affiliations? So we find that almost half of the first authors on these essays had South Asian affiliations, and almost half were based abroad or didn't have South Asian affiliations. And there was a good number of, independent professionals and independent scholars who were writing these as well. These were not only faculty members at specific schools. These were sort of when we coded the kind of focus of these publications, what's their main focus? So building design, for the articles. There were other energy efficiency, design methodology, building materials, some post-colonial, heritage is a big one, resilience, construction management, participatory research. But the biggest was building design. And building design sort of comprised all aspects of. So architecture profession that way still focuses on the building design primarily when it comes to writing academic articles. Books were a little different story. So these were sort of the publishing houses we were looking at. The biggest category was others. So this is a whole range of people, Rowley Books and Neogi. But all of them are top quality books, right? None of this stays away from the great publishing world almost entirely. But with books, it was different. The biggest group of books sort of focused on history and theory, right? And these are practitioners. Many of these are practitioners who are describing their work, right? And that sort of becomes the corpus of history and theory in that part of the world, rather than formal theorization as we would think in other parts of the world. That was a big find. And then other, urban form, conservation, heritage, modernity is still, modernism, indigenous modernities, post-colonial, that kind of literature still sort of continues, but history and theory emerges as the big one. So total books we looked at was 79. This was interesting here. Many practitioners writing these books, and then many with non-South Asian affiliations working. So the books were more international at some level. So inferences, what do we draw from this interim work still in progress? One, there's more academic research and writing than we anticipated. We didn't expect to find this rich, widespread sort of corpus of knowledge. Broader in intellectual spread and geographic reach. We didn't expect that people across the nation and other parts of the world would be writing as well. And then to come back to the more important insight, practitioners' documentation and testimonies, key ingredients for further abstraction and advanced exploration of this emergent corpus of knowledge. Thank you.
Wow.
Good. Come sit. Thank you, Sanjeev. My God, that it's a different take from what I've seen, which is very interesting. I want to make one comment which came to mind, and then I just want to ask you a question to open up. And the comment was what you showed as this roller coaster ride of schools of architecture. And what is very interesting, and this is just a comment, I'm not looking for a response, just be interesting for everyone, is actually if you look at the graph and go back to independence, it's a very slow growth. India and many parts of South Asia liberalized their economy in the 90s. It takes a whole decade before the sector of real estate gets formalized visibly, because real estate was otherwise had an ad hoc kind of operation. Land markets were dysfunctional, not organized. So by 2006, you begin to have the real estate sector established as an area, rubric even, and the growth of schools coincides exactly with that. This is a mapping we did for the State of Architecture exhibition. And my inference for that is very interesting, is that as real estate grows, so do the growth of schools. So therefore, you could argue and conclude it's proportionately, right? It's directly proportionate to the growth of real estate. I would argue it's actually inversely proportionate, meaning it's the opposite, and that's why schools are closing down. So just to put it in simple words, when real estate gets organized and land markets get organized and formalized, you have developers buying large swaths of lands on the periphery of cities and building, gated communities of 10,000 apartments, right? They have one in-house architect who does those designs. That's why they're so awful often, without any variation and inhuman. In some ways, they're almost like public housing as we imagine it. So what happens? A family is driving around, and what are the parents encouraging the kids to do? Study architecture, because there seems to be a boom everywhere. But it's inversely proportionate, because the same 10,000 families in a defense colony kind of low-rise, high-density development, even if there were 10,000 families, and even if one architect got 10 houses to do, there would yet be 1,000 architects employed, versus that one in-house architect who's building for the developer. So actually, as real estate gets organized, the demand for architects diminish. And that's where now you'll start seeing the schools close down. That's my conclusion from my study, at least on this. And so I'm just adding one more layer to your inference, yeah? Okay, so my question, just to kick off the discussion, I'm sure people have questions. You said that I'm just curious, and I think for the group here to be good, you said there's a move away from the state to many other emergent actors in urban planning. Can you kind of unpack that, describe who are these other actors and what forms do they take?
No, that's an important question. So my understanding and sort of looking over time is when India becomes independent, until that moment, the colonial British always kept, actual governance at a certain distance. They wouldn't do anything by themselves, which other words means if it's a city of Delhi or Mumbai, it was the private sector that did most of the building work. So most of the cities are built by the private sector until even one could say up to 50s, 60s. By 60s, there's a shift, and there's a shift towards the state. So, for example, take Delhi, which is perhaps the most documented case, the rise of Delhi Development Authority, the National NCR Planning Board, HUDCO, and by the end of 70s, it was impossible for any private agent to build anything in Delhi. The only thing they could build was at the retail level, at the plot level. You could buy a plot and you could make your own house. But everything else was built by the state. So if you see the Delhi of 70s and 80s, everything is public sector. All the colonies are done by DDA, all the housing, all the agencies, all the masters, the project they were doing, so if you look at someone like C.P. Kukreja's work, or you look at someone like Raj Rival's work, all of them are public sector works. There's very little private left. And that shift changes from 1990s to the extent that today, the state, even for its own, major work like the redesigning parliament, gets turns to private and says, all right, you build it. So that shift, that rising of the emergence of private actors in all aspects of city planning and design work and building work from 90s speed us up to the extent today that even the master plans of the cities, which are statutory plans, are given to private actors, McKinsey's and so on. So that's a major shift that happens within 30 years of time. If we were to reverse the question and say, has states' role diminished? In some ways, yes, but many ways, no. State still occupies the central role and position as the arbiter of power. Yes, that has remained. But nonetheless, the landscape has changed in this sense.
But the trend, just a comment again, and we'll open it up. But the trend, which is very interesting, in all of South Asia, is the state is coming back as patron, but not employing its own agencies. Correct? So it's actually a more complicated situation. It's not about just devolving it to the private.
Yes.
The state, and India is a classic example, is realizing the importance of instrumentalizing architecture in part of the power play and to control it, to make its image, etc. It might employ the private sector and not rely on the innovation of its own state agencies, which they see as being defunct and bureaucratic, and you can't allow the same autocracy to operate there. But the state is coming back in a big way in terms of patronage indirectly. Which is, I think, a very clear trend.
That remains true. But also, I think there is some sharing of power in the sense that, you know, your local MLA or local MP today is little more actively engaged in urban development activity than it was a few years ago. So there is, and then the real estate development lobby, we know once lobbies get formed, for example, what National Highway Authority of India has done beautiful work of creating all these roads, but it has also created a lobby that is invested in keeping the maintenance of the interstates going on, as in this country. You know, even the worst of state, the first thing it does, keeps money aside for building of roads and maintenance of roads. Because once you build the roads, you have to keep maintaining them every 2 or 3 years, right? It needs sustained budgetary support. So there are lobbies that have sort of begun to come up, and they diffuse the power equation a little bit more than it was earlier. So yes, patronage plays an important role, but there is also emergence of other actors that are increasingly important.
Thank you. So let's open it up. You introduce yourself very briefly, name and what program you're in.
Thanks for the presentation, Sanjeev. I'm Sovna Ghatak from the MR2 program here in GSD. And I want to go back to Rahul's comment about the steep rise of architecture schools in India, and then we see a decline of it. And I want to ask you that, do you think it's because of now, if you see that the Architects Act, it does not prohibit individuals to who are not registered with the license to practice architecture. So you don't need the registration or the architectural license to practice. So now, people start to wonder, why do we need to get a degree or an education in architecture? So do you think that the decline is also because of this aspect?
Which is more recent.
It is very recent.
Very recent. Yeah.
So I don't think that, so to the best of my knowledge, council went to the court challenging it, and that stopped. So it didn't pan out. Yeah, it did. And, architecture remains a regulated profession all over the world, and rightly so, because, you're actually making buildings. And so, I mean, I agree with Rahul's comment, but I think also it happened because of the notion that there is a geographic concentration of schools as well as architects in India. We did a mapping with planners. Most of the planners, 80% of the planners are in 15 largest cities, and the rest of the country is open. There's similarly architects, right? I mean, we know most of the architects are clustered in the 20 or 30 largest cities of the country. So it's uneven, the spread both of schools, the distribution of schools, as well as the distribution of architects. I think some of the problem lies there.
Yeah.
I'm very curious about the semantics around the convention of architecture, especially as in some cases and in some contexts, we interchangeably speak about architects and planners and you have shown like the data on like the increasing school of architectures, but I want to open the question to how about planning schools as such. For example, in here, MIT has decided to have like a separate department for like specifically planners. And here in the mock program here, we're embedded in the design school and engage with architects and designers. And it has different approaches depending with the school that you go. But from your experience on what the history you've looked and the conversations you've had, which is a lot, so congratulations. And I'm curious to know, like, these notions and the separation of practices, how is that in the context of India, according to, because that also informs the way you act in the city and the general conception that I have a background in architecture, so we do it all. Or no, planners are planners or architects are architects. So I'm gonna stop talking.
But actually, I just want to, it was a very good question because it's changed now. But I remember when I started practicing, most architects, when they had their boards, it just said architect and planner. They added, and all of that. Urban design wasn't even used as a category, but architect planners. That was a given that it came together. But it's a very good question.
No, it's, I think some of it is to do with the tradition, right? I mean, so Rahul is right. I mean, architects have historically, especially in South Asia, have just like an MBBS doctor. An MBBS doctor is like the first degree. They are everything. They are surgeon, they are physician, they could also do this. So architects have always positioned themselves in that part of the world as someone who can do interiors, landscape, urban planning, what do you want, right? I mean, they would do everything. Exhibition design, signages, and it still holds true, right? So that's why, so that's part of the question. The second is, in that part of the world, the schools coexist. So planning, there is no place I know of. At the graduate level, yes, MIDS, that's Mysore Institute of Development Studies, and then there's one in Chennai, few where it's only planning. But most schools in India offer the two educations together. So it's Department of Architecture and Urban Planning.
Could I try to connect that question also to pedagogy? Would it be, and I mean, I would like Bishil's comments on this too, because he has the experience in this field, is the question of training as a generalist versus a specialist. And architecture schools in many parts of the global south especially have, of course, there's some schools that are based and biased on technologies. If you went to IIT Kharagpur, that might have a bigger bearing on your education. But most schools seem to veer towards the humanities. We spend time on history, we spend time on other. And so therefore, even in the kind of pedagogical structure, the generalists, the architect as generalists, and that's why architects move so easily into other things, all the way from software engineering to photography to other kind of allied fields effortlessly. Yeah. So I wonder if it also, I don't know the answer, but I'm just asking the question that it might come out of the kind of frameworks of pedagogy.
On architects, maybe what we're looking for is not doesn't, or what the developers or real estate market is looking for, no longer falls within the scope of an architect as is being teaching right now. Now it's opening new windows for like actually separation between city making and architect as the building and the product itself.
No, that's a good point. With the growth and the expansion of the market, there is of the real estate market, there is a increasing demand for specialized services. So that is true. But the basic question remains that, these are same schools, even today. There are very few schools. There's a new education policy that they have, the government has promulgated a year ago, and which sort of specifically demands of more established universities and technical institutions across the country to start more planning departments. So all IITs, for example, have been asked to start, and IHS, So planning is at the poise of growing very fast and very quick as cities become these important.
And and as a more important recognized demand.
And some of the people, it seems to me, was thanking for the talk. It was very, very interesting to be the great overview. I mean, I had one thought, couple of thoughts. One was the decline. I was trying to understand the decline. It seems to me
Of schools, you're talking
of schools. I mean, if you look at business practices, generally speaking, in business, when there's a huge demand, a lot of people come to it. And they always overcrowded in every field, right? There's just too much money to be made, and then they realize that they cannot compete, and they're gone. So it's the schools are based on enrollment and making money. Then you are bound to see this. I think what you are seeing, which is in every commerce that's like that. But on my questions were the two. One was that, well, based on your idea of generalist, in India, now that you have the architects doing all these things, does that ability to do everything strengthens the identity as a specific skill, or is it dilutes it? Like saying these guys are all over, right? What's your impression? That is it? Should they say no, focus on design, focus? And many schools here are struggling with that, saying no, we do design. And so, what's your impression of this? Is doing everything makes it more difficult or makes it stronger, the profession? That's one question. And the second thing was more on issues of institution, which you didn't touch, but I know you worked on it coming from planning. The issue of development agencies, creation of development agencies, as opposed to municipalities, etc. And all the cities are doing development agencies. I know that Keshav had been, when he was in the bank working with us, he was very worried about them and about the development agency is making money, but the basic services are being asked to be done by the municipality. So I want you to say a little bit about the institutional landscape. What are you seeing? What are the good things and what we have to worry about? How much power should the development agencies have?
Yeah, well, that's it. That's a good point. And I'll come to that. But the first question, which is about the journalist and what's happening. My sense is that especially in the larger cities, there is a increasing recognition for specialized services. So even within architecture profession, people specialize. They say we do this and we do hotels, or we do, so there is that specialization that has begun to happen at the boutique design firm level. Multinational firms, they do everything, right? I mean, so that's a different category. I haven't sort of looked very closely or interviewed many people in smaller cities, but my sense is tier 3 and smaller settlements, the idea of journalists still plays strong, that one firm would sort of cater all the services. Institutionally, I wanted to focus on the professional associations. That's why I went to that route. But the rise of development agencies is spectacular. And they sort of on all fronts. For every aspect of development, there is a specialized agency. But services, and especially the municipal services, still are the purview of municipal corporations. And they, there is more money to them, both in terms of state support, provincial support, and CSS. For example, Smart Cities project, depending on the jurisdiction of its municipality, so they also get money. So there is some flow of resources there.
From the center, but property tax, I mean, if you look at American cities, the property tax is the main source. Indian cities, and which city has done well in terms of really installing property tax?
Mumbai might be the best example still. Mumbai is for a very long time. There has been little or no movement on that front. So it's and at some level it suits the politicians well, because then the state can have a direct control over the development agency, which is very difficult in case of municipal corporation, local government elections, and all of that. So I'm afraid I don't report much change on that front. What Keshav was describing sort of stands true at some level, though the executive support as well as budgetary support for development authorities has increased over time. And maybe that's the way this, I'm scared to say this, but I see that's the way this country might be thinking of handling urban development in times to come. is through executive agencies and development authorities rather than a municipal function, which would be, wherever it exists, it does. And why I say this? Because newer areas, Bangalore has this example, our book City Planning in India describes several examples. They tried it in Ambi Valley. Noida is a great example where, it's an industrial agency, but sort of is given the municipal functions without sort of any representation of people. And
so what's your impression about the accountability of planning? Like if you see this trend towards development agency, and yes, they're generating money, and then some of them are doing decent work. It's not all, but who is more accountable in a democratic system? Which agency? Is it the municipality or is it the development agency?
Of course, the municipality, but
in fact, the origins of the development agencies and the MMRD in Mumbai was perhaps one of the first examples of that agency. They were intended as visioning agencies to complement the executives, which were the municipality, because you're right, the accountability happens at the municipal level. But over time, the kind of loophole, because the state appropriated these in terms of control, it was always the elected party who had a representative who was the chair of this, that they found it was an efficient way perhaps of centralizing corruption, I don't know, but they started creating special projects and special agencies. Mumbai, the classic case was the Nariman Point, which is the CBD with housing. It's all under a special agency of the MMRDA because it is the gold mine. These became golden gooses for state governments. And so now they are kind of covertly using them to execute also, but projects that have a firewall around them that controls the usage of that money. And I think the evolution into something more effective with the question of accountability is going to be one of the challenges for planning.
But it's an interesting issue because if you look at the growth of this group, why they came into being is really these municipalities and state control things were very slow.
Yes.
There were too many regulations and when the developers, as Rahul has written about impatient capital doesn't have time for municipalities and they want to get things done and make money, right?
Yeah.
So we needed a separate sort of an agency that would allow that, right? And so in the process, did we put the guardrails? That's the question, right?
I guess at some level, yes, because of the political oversight at some level and the media, but that landscape might be changing already, so there's no definitive answer to it. But one thing that remains clear is that they have helped speeden up some of this urbanization and building very fast. These institutions and development agencies are right at the heart of it, and they drive this engine forward.
Yeah, thanks. So, Amy and
my name is Eamon and I'm from the Urban Design Department at the PhD. And my question was that you started with the question of who's making or who's devising these theories about this, like South Asia. So how is the reciprocity about it? Like how are those theories going back and influencing the built environment practices? Or are they just like remaining in the theory level and the built environment practice mostly again the older colonial theories or the American theory or the other theories that are there?
That's a great question. Yeah, fantastic. My sense of it is it's so the one major argument, and this stood out for me, is we essentially find that the theory in the field of architecture in South Asia doesn't get made like it gets made in other fields. This is a theory of practice. It's not a theory of a discipline. It's a theory of practice. So it gets passed on by works like when you study with Rahul, this theory gets passed on in a different manner than when it gets read in a book and sort of is the theory. You see what I'm saying? So that's why the theory of practices is important. And it's theorization of that practice that happens through the device of case study and documentation. And that's a very powerful, very different way of thinking about it. So that theoretical body is powerful, but it works differently than the way we imagined that we would read a textbook called theory of Indian architecture and then use it. No. We do it through projects, we do it through learning from practitioners as to what worked and why and how. So the studio pedagogy then becomes the place where that theorization actually happens. And these books are useful for that purpose, that they're documenting it for the times to come.
Is it also the same in planning of cities? Rather than beyond architecture?
Good question. I think planning is a little different. Yeah, planning, some of it, yes, especially physical planning, but other domains of planning, this is more, we read literature. Planners tend to read more literature than architects do.
But it's also in the planning the focus on poor, informal sector, teaching of course, informal settlements, etc. Planners have been much more open to that and to see how to incorporate them in the city. So it's very rarely you will see a master plan where that doesn't exist. It's just unreal. Bulk of the city is in these areas. So you have to deal with it.
Yeah, and I'm also from Delhi, which has multiple planning units, which have a very complicated relationship. And my question is more specifically about master planning. You've read the DDA 2020 master plan, but it's very clearly written by people with very simple plan. And this is just by that the DDA has its own planning architecture. And my question is, like, how is the profession, if at all, responding to this institutional but takeover by the political consultants to do things like design the lives?
Yeah, I mean, it is. My sense is that this is an interesting moment when things are in flux. So on one hand, on paper, you have, master plan that exists as a statutorily required document through an urban improvement act, right? So there's an act of either the legislature or the parliament that requires that cities make the master plan, just like in this country. Just that in India, these are statutory documents that you follow. So that exists. On the other hand, the question of planning capacity, and Rahul and I were just talking about this, the notion that this, in a country like the US, where we have about 300 million people, and we have almost 80,000 planners registered with American Planning Association. And compare that to with India, where we have 10,000, less than 10,000 trained planners for a country of 1.4 billion, right? So the capacity doesn't exist. And therein comes some of these consulting firms who end up hiring planners who make their master plan. So the plans are still being made, but it's a different group. This is a younger group with some, a retired supervisor who's senior in age sort of making this. And on the third hand is the rise of what in the 80s and 70s in this country we sort of called the strategic planning. Where you have a big framework of a master plan, but the city picks up specific strategic plans and areas that we want to do, right? So the plan exists, it sits, you sort of follow it when you can or when you want to. Otherwise, you do specific strategic plans that you follow in much more intense. So that's how I sort of see the landscape. The three exist in parallel and they overlap.
Then I would add to that thing, the new trend, which is interesting, we're going to master plan because of environmental concerns. You cannot just do it with a strategic plan. You have to look at the overall. And so master plan is back. The overall, which comprehensive planning was out of the window, right?
Sure.
We thought it was unreal, but now, unless you understand the whole thing, what's going on, the large landscape, the water, it's very hard. So it's environmental planning is going to bring it back.
And it sort of brings it back through to supplement it, to take that line of thinking forward, is via the courts. Courts are the one who've sort of taken the custodianship of master plans and regional plans and said, you got to follow it, pay attention to the environment, right? So it adds to that dynamic mix of the kind of actors that are shaping that planning.
Yeah, that's a very interesting.
Actually, this relates in a sense. this last bit of the discussion, my opening question, which is what are the other actors and agencies? Actually, it's all of this combined, that they form a kind of new ecology of planning, which also sets up the checks and balances in the process. And I think what you're saying, Bish, that environmental planning and concerns is bringing holistic thinking back. And so you're going to have many players who will make it happen, which we didn't have previously. And so comprehensive plans got abused or were static and couldn't keep up with responses. So it kind of ties up to that question. What are other comments and
question?
no?
I want to add quickly to what Rahul just where he started. So from Calcutta to Lahore, we saw that map, right?
Yeah.
That's perhaps the most polluted. That's the worst air quality index, right? And people are paying attention to it. And eventually it might just be the court that would say, hey, pay attention to this. So we are now talking about planning at the regional scale from Calcutta to Lahore, because otherwise you can't solve it. You can't solve it at level of Delhi or NCR, right? I mean, so that's the power of that environmental argument, that it would force some sort of a rethinking of
the scale.
of the scale.
I mean, I describe it as the world's biggest megacity. And actually it is also globally going to be the most susceptible zone for climate change effects because of the Himalayas, the waters. And so you have 400 to 500 million people living there. So which means the greatest displacement and migration that will take place on this planet on account of climate change is going to come out of that big megacity, most likely. What other questions, comments? I want to just, if till people think, I hope some other questions come up, but I want to just pick up, I found the research that you've done on the publications and the literature in South Asia very, very interesting. And I hope that can actually be taken further as a project, because I mean, I think one is you've looked at the venues where these things get published. What are the publishers? You have others which have done 1 or 2, and that's why you've taken a threshold of 7 or 8 and then put the name of the publisher, I assume, just knowing from those names. And then you've taken a whole lot of journals, then you've broken it down by practitioners or reflectors who are sitting in South Asia, elsewhere. Are there any kind of emergent patterns that are evident to you? And then, to the question, I think of Amy, I think Amy asked that question about how does this theory go back, and the theory of practice that you talk about. Is there something you're concluding about what might be potent or what might be misaligned about the way the place is being theorized? If you had to be critical about that observation, what does it mean? Because there's value in the way theory has traditionally been done. And
there's big debate in the about southern.
That's right. So within the context of the discussion about Southern theory, what are you trying to conclude, or what are you thinking you might be concluding?
I mean, one thing is evident, clearly evident, and that is that, this is sort of emergent, right? This is last 20 years. If you look back, there were not many architects from South Asia who were publishing in academic journals. It's a new literature at some level. Even the idea of writing, most of the literature before 2000 is Westerners going and talking to architects in that part of the world and writing about their work. So there's a major shift if you see over time. My sense, Rahul, and this might be a hypothesis at this point in time, is that the authors are not yet confident enough to say, hey, here is how I theorize. They are presenting it as a collection of, the two things they know the best, case studies and documentation, right? So maybe in the preface, they say a little bit, in the conclusion, they have some ideas, but it's not. That's why I said there are very few claimants. I mean, nobody's saying, hey, here is a theory that I propose, or here's a narrative. We did a little bit of that in the city planning book, but that was urban planning. So we could track it from 47 to 27. And that's why I think it's happening more at the retail level, at sort of a reflection of individual practitioners who have sort of a substantial body of work that they reflect upon that work. And so it's more piecemeal theorization, if you will. And then, but nonetheless, it forms a large empirical base of knowledge that a scholar could sort of look across time and then So that's where I sort of see the correct.
Thank you for the lecture. Sort of.
Dhruv, that's Dhruv, and he's an
Hi,
MR2 student.
Sort of familiar faces that I just skipped the introduction. Sorry. The theory part of it usually, the problem that I usually say is that research is not backing up theory. So when you're, at least from the experience that I have, planners, architects, urban designers are taught theories to go and practice. It is which is a healthy mindset to have, but a good university, in my opinion, also has theory for the sake of theory, which has research included in it, which has case study included in it, which projects as well as looks back. And in your opinion, how much do you think within the schools that you mentioned is sort of using that model where there is a core of theoretical knowledge that's being passed out from the university model or in a city-based model? You can take SET, you can take SPA, you can take Harvard. Is being passed on to universities from generation to generation of researchers who are also teaching it to urban planners who would go out and work. So that model, I feel like, is a little bit divorced. And researchers are not doing pure research and then only doing practice. So what are your thoughts about that?
No, my sense is, and that's why I said, the theory, the way I use it in this talk was very specific, right? Theorizing the practice, right? It's not, theory can take many different forms and different. So I would say in planning in this country, we have a much more robust base of theoretical ideas than compared to, I would say, architecture. Yeah. Even urban design has a much more sophisticated and nuanced. Landscape architecture, again, I would sort of put with urban design planning, much more nuanced than at some level in architecture. Why? Because, each discipline has its own trajectory. There are theoretical moments, for example, after postmodernism or deconstruction, the whole conception of theory within planning field changed. You see what I'm saying? So for professions, it might make more sense to think of professional insights, useful insights, practical insights that practitioners can use to do their work rather than theories as in a normative classical sense. So we have a corpus of knowledge, right? How, for example, the history and theory of planning sort of walks you through how this has happened, or history of modern architecture sort of walks you through a body of knowledge. What's the takeaway? Takeaways are usually professional insights that you learn in studios, you learn workshops, you learn more seminar classes that are more applicable to work. So I'll make a distinction as to what theory actually means in the.
I guess my question sort of pertains to the amount of room you have in a research-based pedagogical stream to think, to which allow, because when you're doing studio, you're looking for theories to apply. You're looking for things that are already cooked, which can go out and you can apply in some way. So there is an application-based mindset that you sort of develop. And I've been trained as an architect and I've not practiced urban planning or urban design, so I can't speak for those things. But when you are doing research and there's the room to think about these things. So I guess my question is that does the pedagogy allow for these things for a longer, more sustained, nuanced thinking that can have major implications on practice?
Yes, but it takes a long time to practice like that of architecture. Yeah.
Let me add something to it. He referred to, I don't know if you missed it, but he had a comment on pragmatism, right? And he's American. What exactly is it? Pragmatism doesn't believe in theory. Theory comes from the ground. When you are doing as a practitioner and you say this is not working, that's the theory, right? So it's very interesting that India, that kind of self-assurance of practitioners to say what I'm doing is theoretical. Yeah. It's very important that trend, and not sitting down and doing old theory of the old kind and then seeing how it applies. See how they're doing things and then theorize from that.
And it's sort of just to extend that, because I can see your struggle with this, is, design itself, whether it's urban design, whether it's planning and architectural design more specifically, it is about an iterative process, right? That is inherent in design, right? You zoom out, you see the elevation, doesn't look balanced, you zoom in, you rework the openings, you zoom out to see if the openings work well. I mean, just as an example, you do that with plan or your iterative process, right? If you apply that same thinking to theory, then you're making that as you go. That means you're taking a frame, which means I might have worked on a project and I might have written about it. That's why writing becomes important. And I might have discerned a certain experience, which is the reason why Sanjeev did that project, because it came out of a conversation where I was reflecting to him about what I learned from it. And he said, I've got to capture this. Now, you might read that and you might apply what I have discerned as a pattern to a project, but because of the situation, it might be different, and you would be making those iterative moves as you go along, which means you're constructing theory then for someone else to use as a pattern to apply. So it has to be dynamic in that the feedback loops is what keeps theory relevant. Otherwise, theory is, it's what we are applying theory that grew out of the industrializing west of the last century for our town planning, because no one is creating those iterative processes, thinking about the informal economy, what that might mean for the logic of how we make space, etc. So the dynamic nature of those feedback loops in this sort of iterative process, which is design, is I think what Bish and
I
Sanjeev
remember your diagram when you had the exhibition on the elephants thing. So Rahul had a timeline.
Yeah.
And many times the project is stalled because of the money. And then there is a land has to be procured, and the chief minister is not giving. Now, shouldn't that be part of theory? That should, in a planning, that should be that. And he was identifying the trend, why things get delayed. Now, if you say, oh, it's delayed and it's not fulfilling my theory, but theory should be based on the delay is a part of the story. Let's factor it in, right? A role of the government, role of state. I mean, so I think if you believe in actually what's going on the ground, really believe that as the litmus test and not some broad ideas. Those ideas are just starting points.
I completely agree with you. But I'm also not advocating for a figure who's a theoretician who's sitting in a desk in a university who's just reading books and I'm not advocating for that figure, and that figure does not exist.
But although Dhruv, just to interrupt you, that is actually an important figure too, because they set up frameworks that become beginnings.
On ground could be in many ways, right, Rahul?
Of course. So that it's what my point is, or our point is here. Sorry, why we are now all sitting on one panel. Move a little away closer to you. It is that is that even that character is creating a starting point of a framework with a much broader vision of something, which you can take. And it must be taken as being malleable. I think that's Bish's point, to create the feedback loops which enrich. So the frameworks that are the most robust are the ones that get referred to for a century and yet stay relevant. And there are many like that. Right?
But I have one thought. I had one thought from listening to your question, because Doshi died recently, major architect in India. Because Charles was there. And I had one thought about it, because the big architects, sometimes you say, oh, they're too big, they're too detached from reality. But they said a conversation about modernism. And I was going to ask you, through your changes of the 30 or 40-year period, is the Indian version of modernism changing? What's your take on how should India define modernism in its built form?
Well, that's a great question. I haven't sort of spent a lot of time thinking through it, but my sense is that impulse. So, and it sort of came roundabout manner. It's a project that didn't get complete, but we did a little bit of work on this, was to ask Indian architects as to what's good architecture according to, right? So, simple question, what's good architecture according to you? You can describe it in a few words, and you can point a few buildings as examples. The classical modern architecture still remains the yardstick by which practitioners recognize what good architecture. So it lives on, at least in a normative sense. How much it will in practice, I am not so sure.
But a quick comment there before we go to Gauri's is how you separate, and we've had this discussion between what is aesthetic modernity, which is what, at least I argue, came to India before the social modernization project. In the West, the aesthetics of modernism came out of a broader socialization process, right? And it was an aesthetic that came out of industrialization, the creation of a bourgeois, all of that. And there were talented architects that gave it expression, where technology and a modernization process became an aesthetic. in Latin America, in India, in Africa, in much of the global South, aesthetic modernity came there as the illusion of competence to embrace the world, right? And it became part of Nehru's nation building project. And so it got detected, it was actually in reverse, in a sense.
Or parallel.
Or parallel. So this complicates it in the context of South Asia. Yeah.
About how you demonstrated that there's a lot more theory and newer theory from South Asia's planning, architecture, as well as writing. But are the institutions that are teaching these practices integrating them in their curriculum? Or is the curriculum that is being taught in universities with that sort of increased graph able to integrate the new language of theory that we're doing? For instance, a lot of like Southern theory talks about repair as opposed to build. So are we teaching that? Is that transferable into practice at all in how schools are teaching?
A good question. My sense is no. There is a time lag, and that would take some time before some of this gets filtered through. But maybe some schools are doing it better than others, but I'm not aware of, that's not something I've looked at deeply. One other comment I would have on this is my understanding is that the Council of Architecture's stipulation of how the BArch curriculum must be structured are so strict that it doesn't leave much room for most schools to do other stuff, right? I mean, and they hold on to it very strong. So that's what I think.
But actually, it's a nice way to maybe end this, even to your question about architect planner. A lot rests in pedagogy, and I think, Dhruv, your question too intersects with that. And I think it's time that in the South, or however we might describe this other part of the world, actually re-examining how we teach, what we teach in the context of what are the priorities of what we teach, and for what conditions we teach that. Is, I think, going to be the bigger challenge than the institutions and all. They'll come out of that, and the theories will come out of that, being able to articulate that. And I thank you for even beginning a project which is beginning to survey what theory might mean, what are the forums and the platforms in which this is being produced. It's a very important piece of work, and thank you for sharing this with us.
Foundation work.